In this video, I'm going to go over the system menu and identify what everything is. And I'm not going to cover everything in great detail, but there's a few things that we've missed along the way that I'd like to pick up. So to get to the system menu, we just hit the system button, and that unlocks several pages. You use page up and page down to get through all of these pages. You can see it goes to page 9 about. Let's go back to page 1, and then you increment through the things you want to set using previous and next. And you use the value knob right here to set the values. So LCD contrast sets the contrast or the viewing angle. The backlight can be high or low. You can put that in low and low light. The solo mode can be latch, radio, which means only one thing soloed at a time, or control room. I'm going to do a separate video on these to explain what those are for, but for the most part leave it on latch unless you have a reason to use those other two modes. Now you do have the option to show peak holds. All the meters on this board are peak meters. So I'm going to play back a little bit and show you what peak hold does to the meters. It's kind of as you'd expect. You've seen this on other audio equipment, that it actually hangs onto the peak for a few seconds. It's not surprising what it does. If you like to see the peaks held that way, then that's great. I normally leave that off, and that is off by default, but it's kind of a nice option. Now the global aux mutes kind of indicate what happens when you hit mute on a channel, what happens in your monitors or in the monitors that are connected to the aux sends. Normally I would want channels to mute both into your main speaker and into your aux send, so I would leave this at yes, and I would think most people would want this set to yes most of the time. If you set it to no, and if your auxes are set to pre-fader, then they won't mute when you mute the channel. That's a unique use case, and you probably want to have a good reason to set this to no, and also consult the manual on the way that works. Do some testing before you do this in a show, because otherwise you might inadvertently try to mute something because you're changing an instrument and get a lot of buzzing in the monitors that you're not expecting. Most of the time leave this to yes. All right, let's go on to the next page. Now you see the beginning of our network setup. On page 2, it's called Network. And you can see right here, when this says Ethernet, that means I've got an Ethernet cable connected to my router, and that's connecting me to the network. You can, at the same time, and alternatively, connect to a Wi-Fi network. And to choose the Wi-Fi network, you can hit this recall here, hit the recall button here, and that will scan available Wi-Fi networks like this. It's scanning. And then you can roll through all of the networks that are in the air. Now in my studio here, I've got quite a few of them that are in the air, but my router is set to PBJ, so that's the one that I want to connect to. And then to connect to it, then you hit store to join. So you'd hit the store button, and then that will actually allow you to join the network, and then you dial in your password. This shows the IP address for my connection to the router, and that's really all the detail I'm going to get into. I guess one more point is that if you're connected to Ethernet, it overrides the Wi-Fi connection, so you really only need one or the other of these connections. And you need these in order to connect to iOS devices like an iPad running SL Remote or an iPhone running the QMix app, and that you set up on the next page. So if you see right here, page 3 is for iOS setup. We'll get into this in more detail in another video series in the future, but for an introduction to that, I've got my iPad and I'm running SL Remote. And then when you run SL Remote, you get something like this that allows you to connect to the mixer. So I'm going to hit Studio Live 32 and I connect to the mixer, but the whole app is grayed out because you have to have rights to use this, and the rights are set up here on the mixer. So you can see right now it did detect that my device is William Edstrom, which is me, and my iPad running SL Remote. Here I can give it permissions. Now the main permission, now watch this. None. As soon as I go to front of house, this whole mixer opens up on the iPad app, and that allows me to do full mixing of the board. Just about everything you can do through this remote app. It's extremely cool. I'll go over this in a later video series, not this one, but that's kind of how you get started. Now you can dial this in and allow that iPad app to control auxes, a single aux, and you can see all the auxes are available here, or front of house. Now the other thing you can do is allow the iPad app to change the channel names, and it's actually quite convenient on there to change the channel names. That's how you do this. Now if you have more devices, then you can scroll through them here, and that's how you'd also set up iPhone apps for the QMix app. But I'm not going to go into that now. We're going to go on to the next page. Now in this page, we've already covered this. For all of your auxes, you can set them to pre-1, pre-2, or post. So I'm not going to review that again. Page down, you can see that this is the effects pre. We haven't talked about this, but all of your effects can be pre, post, post, post. They could be pre or post, basically. Normally, you would set these to post so that as you turn your faders down, the effects come down with it. Just like you would do if you're using an external effect. You can also set up all 4 of your effects processors pre or post. Normally, these are set to post for standard mixing. Now, if we go here, you can set the sampling rate. Right now, this board is set to 48. When you're connected to a computer, you can choose 48 or 44.1. The computer does not change this. You have to change it right here, and you have to match the computer. You can also choose on here what comes out, the speed of output on the back, which could be the main mix, and all of these other buses you can choose. So that's the main mix. There's a link ID. This currently doesn't do anything. So let's go to page down. This is the sub delays. I showed you this before. We can dial in a delay to use the subs for delayed fill speakers. Have a separate video on that, so we're not going to go over that again. And then here you can lock. Now in order to lock, you can choose if you want to lock faders, lock the master, lock the aux mixes, or scene recall. Typically you'd use these in a fixed install where you've got volunteers running sound. In order to set this up, then you need to use the VSL app to get in here and actually do anything. So you can set these any which way you want, and it isn't going to actually lock it until you hook up the program and enable this feature. So we'll be covering that in a later series, but it's here on page 8. Now, if we go to page 9, you'll see the firmware version. This is the current firmware level at the point I recorded this video. This will almost certainly be a higher revision level by the time you ever watch this. So if you want to check your firmware revision level, then just check here on page 9. If you want to update it, check out the video I made on how to do that separately. So that's a quick overview and explanation, identifying everything in the system menu. Thanks for watching.